This is the business black book, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. In 1990, one man walked out of a boardroom in London and simply disappeared. He left behind a company worth £1.7 billion. He left behind 90,000 employees. He left behind banks, governments, auditors, all of whom had looked this man in the eye and seen nothing wrong. Nothing wrong. His name was Asil Nadir, and what he built, what he stole, and how he vanished is one of the most audacious financial crimes in British corporate history. But here is the part they never teach you in business school. The money was gone long before anyone noticed. This is the business black book, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. Let us begin. The year is 1980. Margaret Thatcher's Britain is hungry. Hungry for entrepreneurs. Hungry for winners. Hungry for proof that capitalism works. That a man with vision and nerve can rise from nothing and build an empire. Asil Nadir was exactly that story. Born in Cyprus, raised in Istanbul, arrived in Britain with ambitions so large it barely fit through the door. He took over a small textile company called Polly Peck International, a firm so obscure, so unimpressive, that most people in the city of London had never heard of it. At the time of his takeover, Polly Peck had a market value of approximately £300,000. Let that sit for a moment. £300,000. Within a single decade, that same company would be worth $1.7 billion. That is not growth. That is not even impressive growth. That is something else entirely. That is the kind of number that makes seasoned investors question their own sanity. That is the kind of trajectory that makes men abandon their skepticism and reach for their checkbooks. And that is exactly what Asil Nadir was counting on. Now, before we go further, you need to understand the atmosphere, because fraud does not happen in a vacuum. Fraud happens in a mood. And the mood of Britain in the 1980s was intoxicating. The city was deregulated. Money was moving faster than it ever had before. New millionaires were appearing overnight. The press was celebrating entrepreneurs like rock stars. And in that euphoria, in that collective drunkenness of wealth, the questions stopped. Nobody asks uncomfortable questions at a party. Polly Peck's business was deceptively simple on the surface. Electronics, fruit, packaging. The company had operations in Turkey and Northern Cyprus, territories that were, at the time, largely ignored by Western financial analysts. And that detail, that geographical obscurity, was not an accident. Because what happens when your business operates somewhere the auditors rarely visit? You get to tell your own story. But Asil Nadir was a magnificent storyteller. He would walk into a room and, within minutes, every person inside it believed they were in the presence of something rare. He had the gift that all great fraudsters share, the ability to make other people feel intelligent for believing him. He did not oversell. He did not beg. He presented his vision with such quiet confidence, such precise authority, that doubting him felt almost rude. Investors loved him. Politicians sought him out. The British press called him a genius. He was awarded the Aube. He hobnobbed with prime ministers. He donated to the Conservative Party. He was, by every visible measure, the immigrant success story that Britain wanted to believe in. But here is what was happening behind that story. And page 47 of the ledger, we find a trick called currency manipulation through subsidiary inflation. Let me explain this simply, because this is where the real architecture of the fraud begins. Polly Peck operated its most profitable subsidiaries in Turkey and Northern Cyprus. These were real businesses, real fruit packing operations, real electronics factories. The businesses existed. That is important. This was not a ghost company. The buildings were there, the workers were there, the fruit was there, but the numbers were living a separate life entirely. Here is how it worked. The Turkish lira and the Northern Cypriot pound were both currencies experiencing significant inflation. When you operate in a high inflation economy, your local revenues can appear enormous in local currency terms, while simultaneously losing real value when converted back to sterling. Most companies in this situation report the currency losses honestly. They apply something called inflation accounting. They show investors the full picture. Polly Peck did not do that. Instead, the company booked its revenues in high-value sterling while hiding its financing costs and currency losses deep inside the subsidiary accounts. The subsidiaries were borrowing money in sterling at high interest rates and lending it back to local operations at even higher rates. The interest payments vanished into the gap between currencies, and the gap was enormous. What this meant in practice was surgical in its elegance and devastating in its dishonesty. The parent company in London showed beautiful profit, gleaming numbers, the kind that make investors salivate. Meanwhile, the subsidiaries in Cyprus and Turkey were accumulating losses so vast, so deeply buried in intercompany loans and foreign exchange transactions, that even trained accountants struggled to see them. The cash was flowing out of the company every single quarter, quietly, continuously, like blood from a wound hidden beneath expensive clothing. And this is the part that will make you sit forward in your chair. The auditors checked. They reviewed the accounts every year. The banks reviewed the lending exposure. The analysts wrote their reports. And almost universally, they gave Polly Peck a clean bill of health. How? Because the numbers at the top looked extraordinary. And when you are showing people extraordinary numbers, they do not go looking for the trapdoor beneath the stage. But that is not even the real story. Because while all of this was happening, while the subsidiaries were quietly hemorrhaging cash into the currency gap, Asil Nadir was doing something else entirely. He was taking money directly, personally, not through complex financial engineering, not through hidden offshore vehicles that took years to trace. He was, according to investigators, removing cash from the company's accounts and transferring it to accounts under his personal control. The amount involved in the eventual charges was £31 million. £31 million in direct transfers from a public company into the pocket of its chairman. And nobody caught it in real time. The Serious Fraud Office would later describe the transfers as so brazen, so poorly concealed, that their very audacity was part of the protection. Because the assumption among regulators and auditors was always that a man operating at Nadir's level, a man that visible, that celebrated, that connected to the political establishment, would not be doing something so crude. Sophistication was his alibi. Fame was his defense. And for nearly a decade, it worked. Now we arrive at the cracks. It is 1990. The British economy is slowing. Interest rates have risen sharply. The easy money of the mid-'80s is tightening, and companies that were built on borrowed confidence are beginning to show the strain. Polly Peck begins to wobble. Not dramatically at first, just a tremor, a slight hesitation in the share price. A rumor here, a short seller there, a few analysts beginning to ask, wait, if this company is so profitable, where exactly is all the cash? Because that is the question that always ends the game. Not the big dramatic accusation, not the government investigation. It starts with a quieter, more dangerous question. Where is the cash? In August of 1990, the Serious Fraud Office raided Polly Peck's offices. Not an investigation, a raid. The kind with warrant cards and removal boxes. The kind that means the conversation has ended and the consequences have begun. Asil Nadir was arrested. He was released on bail. And within weeks, Polly Peck International, one of the 30 largest companies in Britain, the darling of the London Stock Exchange, the crown jewel of Thatcherite entrepreneurial mythology, failed for administration. Gone. £1.7 billion in market value evaporated. 90,000 employees across multiple countries, suddenly working for a company that no longer had a future. Banks that had lent hundreds of millions, staring at the abyss. And at the center of all of it, one man. But here is where the story takes a turn that even the scriptwriters would have rejected for being too convenient. In 1993, while awaiting trial, Asil Nadir boarded a private plane. He had been on bail for 3 years. 3 years of court proceedings. 3 years of legal maneuvering. 3 years of press conferences and denials. And the theater of a man proclaiming his innocence with theatrical sincerity. And then, one night, he flew to Northern Cyprus. Northern Cyprus. The very territory where so much of Polly Peck's business had been conducted. A territory that was not recognized by the British government. A territory from which extradition was legally impossible. He had been on bail. He had surrendered his passport. Or at least a passport. He lived there largely undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. 2 decades. While British pensioners who had invested their savings in Polly Peck received pennies in the pound from the administration, while former employees rebuilt their careers from scratch, while the courts processed the wreckage he had left behind. Asil Nadir was playing golf in the Mediterranean sunshine. He eventually returned to Britain in 2010, voluntarily claiming he wanted to clear his name. The trial that followed was one of the longest and most complex fraud trials in British legal history. In 2012, he was convicted, 23 years after the collapse of the company. 23 years after 90,000 people lost their jobs. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He served 3. Now, let us talk about what this actually means, because it would be easy to frame this as a simple story of a bad man doing bad things. But that framing, that comfortable morality play, misses the deeper lesson entirely. Polly Peck was possible because of a system that wanted it to be possible. Margaret Thatcher's Britain needed its entrepreneurial heroes. The city needed its rising stars. The banks needed their fee income. The auditors needed their retainers. The politicians needed their donors. Everyone in the ecosystem had a financial incentive to believe, and belief is the most powerful financial instrument ever created. When a system collectively decides to believe, it stops looking. And when it stops looking, the space created is not empty. It is filled instantly by whoever is bold enough to walk into it. Asil Nadir was bold enough. The currency manipulation he used, it was not an invention from nothing. It exploited real accounting complexity, real gaps between how inflation-adjusted accounts could and could not be presented. He found the dark space between the rules, and he built a palace in it. The personal transfers, they were hidden not through genius, but through volume. Polly Peck was processing so many transactions between so many subsidiaries across so many currencies that 31 million pounds of suspicious movement could be absorbed into the noise. This is a lesson that every financial crime teaches us. Eventually, scale is camouflage. Complexity is a weapon. And the bigger the institution, the harder it becomes for anyone inside it to see the whole picture. Nobody at Polly Peck woke up one morning and decided to participate in fraud. Most of the people inside that company were ordinary. They did their jobs, they processed their transactions, they filed their reports. But ordinary people doing ordinary jobs inside an extraordinary fraud become, without ever choosing it, part of the machinery. That is what makes this story not just a business story, not just a crime story. It is a story about architecture, about how systems are designed and who gets to design them, and what happens when the architect has a very different plan than the one shown to everyone else. Asil Nadir built something impressive, genuinely impressive. The businesses were real. The growth was real. The operations in Cyprus created real employment, real output, real economic activity. But beneath the real business, he built a second architecture, a shadow structure, designed not to create value, but to extract it. Designed not to last, but to last just long enough. Long enough for him to take what he came for. And when it collapsed, when auditors finally arrived with the right questions and the wrong assumptions were stripped away, what they found was not just a fraud. They found a hollow at the center of something that had looked completely solid. 1.7 billion pounds of perceived value, reduced in the space of weeks to a negative number. The question that should haunt every investor, every regulator, every analyst who approved of Polly Peck is simple and merciless. What were we actually looking at? Not the company, not the business, not the fundamentals. We were looking at a performance, a decade-long performance staged by a man who understood that the audience only sees what you point at and never thinks to look at what you are hiding behind your back. Asil Nadir is now in his 80s. He lives quietly. He gives occasional interviews in which he maintains, with remarkable consistency, that he was a victim, that the case against him was politically motivated, that the real story has never been told. He may be right about that last part. The real story of Polly Peck is not about one man's greed. It is about a financial ecosystem that was structurally incapable of asking the right questions at the right time. It is about how deregulation, political proximity, and the hunger for heroes creates the perfect growing conditions for exactly this kind of fraud. And that story, that systemic story, has never really been told because it implicates too many people who are still in the room. 1.7 billion pounds, 90,000 employees, 3 years served. The numbers do not balance. They never do. And with that, the Black Book closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.